He didn't shout. He didn't negotiate. He didn't rush. He mailed the rules. At 9:40 a.m., beside a cemetery wall, one decision turned a private threat into a permanent record. In early 1943, Betty Grable's life was heavily influenced by her status as a Hollywood star and wartime pinup. Her routine was driven by studio schedules, public appearances, and constant attention, making her vulnerable to threats. The first sign of this vulnerability arrived in the form of a mailed extortion letter. It was delivered with routine mail, but carried a deadly demand once opened. The letter was clear and direct, demanding $25,000 worth of uncut diamonds. It specified that the diamonds be mailed in 2 envelopes to Jonathan C. Wild, SQ Gates Hotel, in Los Angeles. The sender, using the alias The Leo, made the demand under the threat of harm or death. Grable's team treated the threat seriously, preserving the letter as evidence and handing it over to law enforcement. Because it was sent through the U.S. mail, the FBI became involved due to federal jurisdiction over mail-based threats. This moved the case beyond local law enforcement. The FBI's initial task was to handle the letter with care, documenting the details. The demand for uncut diamonds indicated an attempt to avoid traceable currency, while the hotel address suggested the sender wanted control over the exchange without direct contact. This narrowed the FBI's investigation to a specific location. Grable's high visibility made her routines predictable, and this made her an easy target for an extortionist. The rumors about her insuring her legs added to her public image of wealth, which the extortionist could exploit. The threat was tailored to make her feel the urgency and danger. The instructions in the letter were precise. The FBI's next step was to prepare for the extortionist's next move. They anticipated further communication, possibly in the form of additional letters. Their objective was to handle the situation without provoking the extortionist into violence. The FBI began surveillance at the hotel address provided by the extortionist. The alias Jonathan C. Wild, SQ, was now a key lead, and the address became a focal point for further investigation. This was no longer a private matter, but a federal investigation. At this point, the FBI was still uncertain about the extent of the threat. The extortionist might escalate if the demand wasn't met. The first letter set a clear expectation, but the situation remained fluid. The FBI's approach included monitoring the hotel and preparing for any follow-up actions from the extortionist. Grable's life, once dominated by public appearances, was now constrained by security measures. The investigation had shifted from handling the immediate threat to creating a plan for capturing the extortionist. Betty Grable's life changed with the arrival of an extortion letter. Until then, her mail consisted of contracts and studio correspondence. But when she opened the envelope, it contained a direct, fear-driven demand: $25,000 in uncut diamonds to be mailed to Jonathan C. Wild, SQ Gates Hotel, Los Angeles. The signature, The Leo, added a theatrical tone to the threat. It was clear and unambiguous. Her life was at risk. Once the letter was read, Grable's staff acted quickly, preserving the document as evidence. They examined the handwriting and paper, then handed it over to the authorities. The use of U.S. mail elevated the case to federal jurisdiction, and the FBI quickly took charge. The FBI's Los Angeles office began formal documentation. The letter was photographed and cataloged, even noting staple marks and fold lines. Analysts found the letter to be well-written and clean, suggesting the sender had basic education and access to a typewriter. The address, the Gates Hotel, was a public, busy location, making it both useful and risky for investigation. The FBI had to monitor the hotel without revealing their presence, carefully filtering through innocent visitors. The FBI examined the letter's structure, comparing it with other extortion letters. The phrase "under threat of your life" or "great bodily harm" appeared in past cases, hinting that the sender might be influenced by previous extortion attempts. The alias The Leo was unique, and no known criminal used that signature. While the investigation continued, Grable's daily life proceeded under strict security. Her mail was screened, and her schedule was adjusted to minimize risk. The goal was to maintain her public composure while reducing opportunities for further threats. The FBI discussed whether to act immediately or wait for more communication from the extortionist. They chose patience, monitoring the hotel's mail for any follow-up. The first few days after the letter showed no new deliveries. The weeks following the first letter were tense, with the FBI counting on the sender to make another move. History showed that extortionists often followed up if their first demand wasn't met. The FBI anticipated a second letter. As they waited, analysts focused on the practicalities of the demand. Uncut diamonds were an unusual request, revealing the sender's lack of knowledge about how gemstones were sold. This suggested the extortionist might be inexperienced. and influenced by media depictions of wealth. The FBI prepared for potential surveillance. If a courier attempted to collect mail under the alias, they planned for every possibility, including changes in language or tone in a second letter. Grable's studio team knew about the threat, but was kept in the dark about the full investigation. They were instructed to enforce discretion, to avoid leaks to the press. Grable herself kept a composed public appearance, hoping to make the extortionist believe she was ignoring him. By mid-March 1943, the investigation was ongoing, with the FBI coordinating with headquarters to ensure no similar threats appeared elsewhere. They continued to cross-check for any match in handwriting or aliases. Despite the absence of new leads, the FBI continued its investigation. They reviewed hotel records, checked typewriter repair shops, and exhausted every lead. But no suspect emerged. The FBI understood that mail threats could remain dormant for a while, but they continued with a clinical approach. Public confidence was at stake, and agents worked in secrecy to protect Grable. By mid-March, the first letter became part of the case file, preserved for future reference. It marked the shift from a personal threat to a federal operation. The next steps depended on when the extortionist would make his next move. When the second letter arrived, it followed the expected pattern, more detailed, more urgent. But that development marked the next phase of the story. The first letter had transformed the situation into a full-scale investigation, and the FBI was now focused on identifying the extortionist behind Ali. When the first letter reached federal hands, the crime shifted from a private threat to a national matter. Betty Grable's fame made her a prime target for extortion, demanding a federal response. The FBI's Los Angeles field office understood the stakes. Failure would not remain local. A threat against Grable, the country's top star, required a swift and competent federal response. The first briefing took place at the Los Angeles headquarters. The letter was clear, structured, and calm, revealing the sender's controlled demeanor. It suggested a dangerous individual, one who believed he could control the situation. Agent Nelson C. Ball led the analysis, classifying the case under federal extortion statutes, particularly 18 U.S.C. to define the legal scope of the investigation. The letter's delivery via U.S. mail solidified the FBI's jurisdiction. Agents compared the language to past cases. Unlike typical extortionists, the layup style was formal, focused on control and compliance, rather than violence. This made the threat more chilling, and indicated a calculated, confident individual. The FBI coordinated with the U.S. Postal Inspection Service for surveillance of the Gates Hotel mailbox. Cameras and plainclothes agents were stationed, with the hotel staff sworn to secrecy. Each envelope addressed to Jonathan C. Wild, SQ, was logged and separated for further action. For days, the operation sat idle as no new envelopes arrived. Meanwhile, forensic technicians examined the typewriter's mechanical flaws, which were cataloged in the Bureau's typewriter registry. They hoped to narrow the search if the typewriter had been recently serviced. The FBI also interviewed jewelers about the extortionist's unusual demand for uncut diamonds. None reported any inquiries, suggesting the sender lacked knowledge of how such a transaction would be executed. This reinforced the theory that the extortionist might be inexperienced. Grable continued her work under strict security. Agents shadowed her, and her mail was screened. The goal was to maintain normalcy in public, while quietly securing her surroundings. As the FBI waited, they analyzed the extortion letter's phrasing, with Washington's division, breaking it down linguistically. The formal tone and use of SQ suggested the sender might be young, literate, and trying to project sophistication. The alias Jonathan C. Wild was theatrical, an amateur criminal referencing an infamous 18th century figure, suggesting the offender sought attention. By the second week, permanent surveillance was established at the Gates Hotel. Agents monitored the lobby and street, posing as businessmen, while the hotel staff cooperated discreetly. The Bureau also expanded surveillance to telegraph offices, in case the extortionist switched to telegrams for communication. Grable's circle grew tense as her security increased. She avoided unknown senders and traveled under surveillance, maintaining the illusion of a normal life. Inside the Bureau, discussions began about potential escalation, including kidnapping scenarios. The agents prepared for the next phase, expecting a more urgent move from the extortionist. The weeks of silence stretched into tense anticipation. The FBI prepared for frustration from the extortionist, who was likely to escalate soon. On March 18th, a second letter arrived, marked by a more urgent tone and reduced demand, $5,000 in cash instead of diamonds. It included an explicit threat: if the money wasn't delivered, the recipient will not be alive on the 20th. This shift in tone marked the case's escalation. The FBI quickly set up an operational plan, mapping out the location for the exchange. They prepared surveillance and undercover agents, positioning themselves strategically for the scheduled meeting. The extortionist had given the FBI control of the environment by dictating the meeting place. The Bureau planned meticulously to ensure a successful operation. The morning of the exchange, agents took positions around the cemetery, with a package of marked bills ready for the drop. The operatives were briefed to follow the extortionist's instructions exactly. At 9:40 a.m., the extortionist arrived. A young man appeared on foot, approached the package, and was immediately surrounded by agents. The operation ended with a swift arrest. The suspect, Russell Eugene Alexanderson, an 18-year-old local with no criminal record, was apprehended. Alexanderson admitted to sending the letters but claimed he never intended harm. He had been fascinated with Grable and wanted the money to meet film stars. His typewriter matched the forensic signatures found in both letters, confirming his involvement. The arrest marked the end of immediate danger, but raised deeper questions about motive and obsession. Alexanderson's need for recognition had turned into an extortion attempt, blending admiration with threat. The FBI had its suspect. The operation was a success, and Grable was returned to work under renewed protection. The case demonstrated how a mailed threat could mobilize federal law enforcement, forensic science, and tactical operations in a matter of weeks. The arrest at the cemetery wall did not end the case. It stopped the immediate danger, but began a longer process to establish identity, link the suspect to the letters, preserve evidence, and ensure the filmed record, packages, and movements were secure. The case shifted from surveillance to custody, with every action now documented. The suspect, Russell Eugene Alexanderson, was quickly removed from the scene to prevent civilian attention and press interference. The arrest was staged to appear ordinary from a distance, but the priority was to secure him before anyone could understand what happened. The staged payoff package was treated as crucial evidence. The serial numbers of the bills were documented, and it was handled with care, as it was integral to proving the suspect had attempted to claim money. The package entered a chain of custody that would be accounted for at every stage. The 16mm film footage of the operation was critical. It captured the suspect's approach, his behavior, and the exact moment he attempted to collect the package. The footage was secured to avoid tampering or loss, as it was vital evidence. At the Bureau's field office, Alexanderson's identity was confirmed. 18 years old, a young man whose calculated letters were at odds with his age. The letters seemed adult-like, making the contrast more unsettling. The FBI's next task was to link Alexanderson to the letters. The letters, their envelopes, and typewriter flaws were preserved. The FBI moved to recover the typewriter used, which would provide a direct match for the letters. The Bureau seized the typewriter and materials, planning to compare mechanical flaws, ribbon patterns, and paper stock to the extortion notes. Postal records were examined to establish the mailing origins. Postmarks and routing supported the timeline and provided geographical clues. Grable's protection remained a priority. The FBI kept her life private while ensuring her safety, allowing her to maintain normalcy in the public eye. Alexanderson admitted to sending the letters but claimed he never intended harm. However, the threat itself made the crime undeniable. His confession added to the case, but physical evidence was still needed for conviction. The case went to court, where Alexanderson was sentenced to 5 years probation. The outcome felt incomplete given the threat, but the legal system took his youth and the lack of violence into account. Alexanderson later sent another extortion note, signaling a repeated pattern of behavior. This led to his second arrest and a prison sentence. The second note showed that Alexanderson's obsession with Grable had not ended. His fixation was no longer an isolated incident, but a pattern of behavior. The FBI documented the operation as a model for future cases. It demonstrated how a mailed threat could be controlled through surveillance, evidence collection, and coordinated tactics. The FBI compressed the investigation into a clear narrative, using meticulous documentation to support the case and ensure conviction. Grable's life continued publicly, but the fear lingered. The immediate threat was stopped, but the impact of the crime remained. The case showed how a mailed threat could evolve into a large-scale federal operation. The sting at the cemetery wall became famous not just for the arrest, but as an example of how a mailed threat, which began as paper, could escalate into a carefully planned operation. The extortionist, a young man with no criminal connections, believed he could use threats to bridge the gap between his life and Betty Grable's. The FBI stopped the transaction, captured him, and produced a court outcome. However, the real lesson was how quickly obsession can turn into a federal case. The first letter had already traveled its route and proven how close obsession can get to the target. The Bureau had its suspect, documented the operation, and secured a legal result: probation followed by prison after re-offense. The case moved from threat to trap, from custody to court, and as the evidence was sealed, it became part of the Bureau's legacy. The crime began as a mailed message, but it turned into a record of how the FBI could use planning, surveillance, and federal jurisdiction to tackle threats sent through the mail, making this case one of the earliest instances of its kind. After the arrest, the FBI's next task was to convert their complex operation into a legally admissible story. They had already gathered critical evidence: the letters, the threat language, the drop point, the film, the marked money, and the agent's observations. Each element supported the others, and none could be overlooked. The extortion letters were preserved, along with envelopes for postmarks and routing marks. The second letter's precise details, location, time, and the collector's actions, helped transform the suspect's actions from coincidence to a planned crime. The FBI's operation was built around this logic, making it key to the legal case. The film footage of the operation was vital. It documented the suspect's approach and movements, providing more than written reports could. The footage was carefully stored to prevent tampering or doubt, serving as an essential piece of evidence alongside the letters and marked money. Alexanderson's age raised questions about motive. At 18, his cinematic demands, like uncut diamonds, seemed more fantasy than practical. The shift to a cash demand indicated a retreat to something more achievable, revealing impulsive behavior rather than criminal strategy. Despite Alexanderson admitting to sending the letters, the FBI continued gathering independent proof. The typewriter used to write the letters was seized to compare mechanical flaws, ensuring authorship could be linked to forensic evidence rather than just his confession. The FBI also managed the risk of public exposure. With Grable as the victim, the Bureau needed to control the flow of information to prevent speculation and leaks. Knowledge was limited to those who needed it, ensuring the investigation remained discreet. As the case progressed, the legal narrative had to fit statutory elements. The first letter established the extortion attempt with a demand for diamonds, while the second escalated to a cash demand with a precise collection time and location. The sting operation proved the suspect's physical participation, and evidence handling created a connected chain for the prosecution. The first outcome saw Alexanderson plead guilty and receive 5 years probation. The decision seemed unusual, but factors like his age and the fact that no harm occurred played a role in the legal outcome. However, Alexanderson reoffended, sending another extortion note, demanding $500. This smaller amount indicated either desperation or a belief that it might go unnoticed. But the true significance was the reoffense, showing that his core behavior had not changed. The reoffense led to another arrest, and this time, Alexanderson was sentenced to prison. The move from probation to prison demonstrated a hardening of consequences due to repeated behavior. The system had shifted from viewing him as a reckless offender to someone with a demonstrated pattern. The reoffense also changed how the sting operation would be remembered. Initially celebrated for its planning and use of technology, the operation's success became overshadowed by the realization that the offender's psychological drivers persisted, even after arrest. Alexanderson's motives became clearer after his confession, but his obsession with Grable added complexity. He claimed he wanted to meet movie stars, but this only highlighted how his obsession had led to coercion, as a way to force proximity to the Hollywood world he idolized. For Grable, the legal outcome didn't erase the experience of being threatened. While the case resolution removed immediate danger, the fear caused by the letters lingered, and the victim had to reconcile the fact that the threat had come from someone reachable through ordinary channels. The case became a teaching instrument for the FBI. It showed how mailed threats could be countered with careful planning and staged contact. The reoffense confirmed that probation doesn't always stop an offender driven by obsession. By the time Alexanderson was imprisoned, the Bureau had a lasting record. The case became a part of FBI history, documented through letters, photographs, film, and narrative framing, ensuring that the story would be retold for years to come, even when Alexanderson later tried to stop televised retelling of the events. This phase demonstrates the movement from federal arrest to legal outcome, then reoffense. It shows how control is contested at every stage, first by the extortionist, through written threat, then by the Bureau through surveillance and arrest, and finally by the legal system, which hardened consequences when the offender refused to stop. The second arrest wasn't as dramatic as the sting, but it was final. With the offender already known, the FBI no longer needed a public space trap. It was a response to a new crime by the same person. The shift from probation to confinement was a tightening of consequences. The shift from probation to prison marked a crucial moment. Probation implied compliance under oversight, but reoffending showed that fear or obsession could override this. Repetition made the case stronger, and the rationale for incarceration grew. The second offense redefined the sting at the cemetery wall. The earlier operation had demonstrated coordinated surveillance and arrest, but the reoffense showed that not all offenders respond to probation. Alexanderson's motive became clearer with his confession. He admitted to sending the letters, but framed them as an attempt to meet movie stars. His obsession with Grable turned extortion into coercion. This explanation, while unsettling, didn't excuse his actions. For the FBI, the return to the mail reinforced the lesson that mailed threats could be answered with careful planning, and that the offender's ability to repeat the method needed to be contained. The focus shifted from catching to preventing, as the offender had shown willingness to continue. Grable's position remained one of constrained privacy. The FBI had to manage public exposure to avoid sensationalism. The second arrest reduced the immediate risk, but it didn't erase the fact that someone had targeted her. Imprisonment gave the case closure that probation didn't. It removed Alexanderson's ability to continue the extortion through the mail. The case also highlighted the role of documentation, as the FBI's filmed records became part of institutional memory, and could later resurface in public arenas. The later reoffense changed how Alexanderson's initial claims were viewed. His return to extortion after being caught suggested that his behavior was driven by obsession, not external hardship. The reoffense confirmed escalation by repetition. The case had two endings: the cinematic sting at the cemetery wall and the quieter, more definitive shift to imprisonment. Together they formed the full historical arc of the case. First an operation to expose the sender, then a response to remove his ability to repeat the crime. The case also set the stage for its cultural afterlife. Once filmed and preserved, it became material that could be reused and retold. The fact that Alexanderson later tried to stop a television broadcast about the case highlighted the tension between legal documentation and public memory. By the end of this phase, the case had demonstrated two truths. First, that mailed extortion can be stopped with careful planning and coordination. Second, that offenders driven by fixation may return to the same method, forcing the system to escalate consequences. The story moved from threat to sting to court, showing that when the method is repeatable, the focus shifts from catching to preventing. After the second arrest and prison sentence, the case lost immediate urgency, but didn't disappear. The threat to Betty Grable was neutralized, but the extortion had been carried out through mailed documents, creating a record that could be reconstructed long after the risk had passed. The case became a file that could be reopened, not just by investigators. The FBI approached the operation with an unusually visual mindset for its time. It involved detailed charts, undercover disguises, advanced tools like binoculars, radios, and a 16mm camera to document the operation. The footage provided undeniable evidence, showing the suspect's movements and the moment he approached the payoff package. The Bureau curated a photo set documenting the operation, the planning, filming, payoff package preparation, and the arrest. These weren't random snapshots, but part of a record that highlighted the Bureau's planning and modern tactics. The record didn't fade naturally. It became a reference both for internal training and for a broader institutional narrative. For Grable, the permanent nature of the case's documentation created an uneven kind of closure. The immediate threat had been handled, but the case remained in the public eye due to the fame of the victim. Even after the offender was imprisoned, the case's notoriety ensured it wouldn't be forgotten. Russell Eugene Alexanderson remained tied to two public aliases, the Leop and Snow. These names were part of his attempt to control perception and create an aura of inevitability around his demands. The fear linked to these aliases stayed with the victim because the record preserved them. Later reporting added detail to the timeline, and Alexanderson's self-explanation. He admitted sending the letters but claimed he never intended harm and wanted the money to meet movie stars. His fixation on Grable made the case unsettling, as obsession can lead to threats and coercion. The legal arc had two distinct outcomes: probation after the cemetery wall arrest, and a later arrest followed by prison. The first outcome seemed measured, but the second proved that reoffending after leniency is harder to frame as a simple lesson. It showed limits of deterrence and supervision. The FBI's careful documentation ensured the operation could be viewed as a tactical sequence. The second letter's cash demand and the exact time and place provided a framework for the operation. The arrest unfolded as planned, with the offender caught during the payoff attempt. The case couldn't stay purely legal because of its concrete details. The combination of aliases, precise timing, and filmed evidence transformed it into a story, not just a file. The FBI's curated photo set confirmed that the case represented more than an arrest. It was an example of how the Bureau responded to a mailed threat. Time passed, but the case's documentation ensured it wouldn't fade. The crime had already become part of public culture. By the 1950s, TV and media had started reusing it, turning the crime into drama. The offender's later attempt to stop a broadcast only showed how the case had become larger than its original crime. The 1957 dispute confirmed the power of the 1943 record. Alexanderson's complaint underscored that filmed evidence isn't just proof, but portrayal. The case's documentation meant it could be repurposed for public narrative, illustrating the tension between law enforcement's image and the offender's desire to block his exposure. For Grable, the return of the story through TV and legal disputes reinforced the central injury of a mailed threat. It refuses to stay confined to one moment. A mailed threat can extend its influence through records, keeping the victim tied to the past event. The case's significance remained intact through its cultural afterlife. It demonstrated how mailed threats could become a federal matter, how surveillance and filming could be used as evidence, and how the offender reoffended despite probation. It also showed how the case remained culturally alive, with evidence that could be reused for later retelling. The case persisted because of clarity. The letters had demands. The operation had a time, location, and film. And the offender had a name and documented trajectory. This solidity ensured the case would be remembered and retold whenever needed. The offender's attempt to stop a broadcast confirmed the central obsession of control in every phase of the story. The Bureau had contained the threat, but the record ensured that the case could reach beyond its original moment, remaining part of public narrative. By 1957, the original danger of 1943 had long been neutralized. The offender had been identified, arrested, and imprisoned after re-offending. However, the case had never relied solely on immediate danger. It was built on mailed threats, precise instructions, and an FBI response that created a lasting record through photographs, charts, and film. This documentation allowed the case to be revisited later, not as rumor but as a reconstructed sequence. The case's transition from federal file to television did not require changing the events. It only required retelling. The FBI's detailed documentation made it authentic, giving the case a narrative that could be used for dramatic purposes. The offender's aliases, the Lee-Up and Snow, and the cinematic details of the sting made the case attractive for retelling on television. For Alexanderson, time did not erase his identity. His name remained attached to the crime, and the victim's fame ensured the story would persist. The filmed sting made the case visible in a way that courtroom documentation could not. His public exposure, long after the case's closure, became inevitable. In November 1957, Alexanderson attempted to prevent CBS TV from airing an episode titled The FBI, claiming it used footage from the 1943 investigation and involved his name and likeness. This attempt was a bid for control, not over the crime, but over his public exposure. The same crime that had empowered him through intimidation now threatened to make him permanently visible. Alexanderson sought a temporary restraining order to stop the broadcast. The urgency of his request indicated a fear of exposure, as once the program aired, the exposure would be permanent. The dispute highlighted the power of television in 1957 to transform a legal case into public entertainment, bringing an old crime to a new audience. The court denied his request for a restraining order, allowing the broadcast to proceed. This decision marked a clear procedural line. It prevented Alexanderson from stopping the broadcast and confirmed that the case had outgrown him. The public life of the case was no longer something he could easily control. This dispute showed the case's lasting power. The 1943 sting had been an operational tool, but the evidence created in 1943 now became part of the public narrative. Television could replay the events, reviving the case for new audiences. The offender's attempt to block the broadcast only proved the case's enduring presence in public culture. The 1957 dispute also highlighted the case's deeper lesson about control. In 1943, the offender had tried to control Grable through mailed threats. The FBI responded with a methodical operation that ensured control. In 1957, the offender attempted to control the public memory of his crime, but the court's decision reinforced that once a case is part of public culture, it resists being contained. The case's endurance came not from ambiguity, but from its concrete details. The names the Lee-Up and Snow, the hotel address, the pivot from diamonds to cash, the cemetery wall, the exact time, and the filmed sting were all specific elements that made the case easy to retell. These details became anchors that pulled the past forward, ensuring the case's continued public life. The dispute in 1957 didn't change the original record. It demonstrated the power of the case's documentation. It showed that a case can end in the justice system, but its impact can continue in public life. The mailed threats had been answered by federal strategy, but the broadcast threat could not be answered the same way, as it was a question of whether an old crime could ever truly be kept in the past. After the 1957 attempt to stop the CBS TV broadcast failed, the case entered its final form, a story kept alive by documentation. The legal machinery had completed its work. Russell Eugene Alexanderson was arrested, pleaded guilty, and received probation. He re-offended, leading to another arrest and a prison sentence. These facts closed the case file, but the story remained alive because the case had been built on documentation. The record wasn't passive. It was deliberately constructed. The FBI used advanced tools like a 16mm camera, walkie-talkies, and undercover disguises to ensure the operation could be proven in court. These artifacts, film, photos, notes, made the case usable beyond prosecution, allowing it to be retold as a factual narrative. The FBI preserved the operation in a photo set titled Betty Grable Extortion Letters, showing each step of the operation: planning, filming, payoff package preparation, suspect surveillance, and the arrest. These images became part of the Bureau's internal training, ensuring the story stayed accessible for public retelling. The victim's identity, Betty Grable, kept the case visible. As a major film star and WWE pinup icon, her fame ensured that the case wouldn't fade away. Even after the offender was caught, the story stayed relevant, in part because of the case's celebrity connections. Alexanderson, at 18, was not a seasoned criminal, but a teenager with a fixation on Grable. His made the case disturbing, and highlighted how fame could attract people seeking identity through proximity. The legal outcomes added a layer of texture to the case. Initially, Alexanderson received probation after his guilty plea. Later, after reoffending, he was sentenced to prison. This progression showed how the system responded in stages, and it prevented the sting from being seen as the full narrative. The reoffense proved that catching the offender didn't stop the behavior. The case's documentation became both proof and content. The film footage was not only used in court, but could be replayed, framed, and embedded into new narratives. Alexanderson's attempt to block the broadcast confirmed the power of documentation, and how evidence can outlast its immediate legal purpose. The FBI's summary focused on operational elements, charts, filming, radios, and avoided turning the case into myth. The official sequence remained consistent across retellings, making the case stable and resistant to distortion. For Grable, the case's persistence meant her name could be reattached to danger whenever the case resurfaced. Her identity was fixed in the public record, and her privacy was never fully restored. For Alexanderson, the case's endurance kept him visible, even after his sentence. The attempt to stop the broadcast showed his understanding that public retellings would keep his identity connected to the crime. This phase shows how a case evolves from danger to documentation, and how that documentation can generate a secondary conflict. It illustrates how a crime that begins with a mailed threat can create a record that resurfaces and creates new challenges years later. The final result is a case defined by preservation. The mail created jurisdiction and threat. The operation created proof. The proof created permanence. The permanence created a later fight over portrayal. The case refused to stay buried, surviving as a record that could be reopened and retold. The case settled into an institutional afterlife after the immediate threat ended. Once Alexanderson was imprisoned, the FBI shifted focus to preservation and reference. The evidence, including extortion letters, chain of custody logs, operational charts, and film reels, was organized, labeled, and stored to withstand both court scrutiny and time. Every piece remained connected to a simple jurisdictional origin. The threats traveled through U.S. mail, placing the case under federal authority. The Bureau's internal use of the case did not rely on sensational framing, but on sequence. The record's power came from showing decisions leading to outcomes without gaps. From the first letter's structure to the second letter's escalation, the sting's design, and the legal outcomes. The case's visibility outside the Bureau was shaped by the same factual structure. Grable, a famous wartime icon, ensured the story wouldn't remain private. The extortion attempt anchored to a specific moment in her career, when her visibility was at its peak. The offender didn't need proximity, only the mail. In the years that followed, the case continued as a constraint for Grable, even as public life moved on. A mailed threat forced a victim to reconsider what could be trusted, not just who. The resolution didn't undo the fact that the threat had already been received and processed emotionally. The record preserved the case, ensuring it could return with renewed attention, not renewed danger. Inside the Bureau, the case was used for training. The photographs in the curated set did more than show the outcome. They showed preparation and sequence. The Bureau created a photographic and filmed account of its own tactics, unusual for its time. The visual documentation strengthened the case's authority and made it usable beyond law enforcement. A filmed arrest is not just evidence, it is a scene. The case's presentation as a technology-forward operation reinforced that perception. By preserving the visuals, the Bureau preserved not only what happened but how it could be perceived. The case's origin was simple. A letter arrived. The FBI responded by capturing the offender when he tried to convert threat into payment. The later reoffense and the television dispute showed that capture and leniency didn't necessarily remove the impulse. For Grable, the case could be reattached to her name whenever retold. Her celebrity status ensured attention, and the FBI's preservation of her career context ensured the case's weight. The record meant the association could be revived without her participation. For the Bureau, the case became a demonstration of capability. It served as a model for federal jurisdiction, investigation, and professional control. The case's survival as a lesson had a purpose beyond historical interest. It symbolized federal control in response to a threat delivered through the mail. By the end, the case's essential dynamic was clear. Control over the case moved through mail, street, court, broadcast, and finally, control over memory. The record outlived the crime because it was built to be proof, and proof is durable. The record's durability created a persistent story that could be reopened, replayed, and retold whenever preserved evidence found a new platform. The crime stopped, but the story didn't, because the record was built to last. When legal outcomes transitioned from probation to prison, the danger ended. The offender's ability to repeat the behavior was minimized. But the case wasn't erased. The Grable extortion story, built on key elements like a famous name, written threats, and a filmed sting, remained. Even after the threat passed, the case was retrievable and reusable, for demonstrating how mail-based threats are met with federal methods. The case began with the first letter, demanding $25,000 in uncut diamonds. The offender used the mail, which made the case federal. The structure showed confidence, expecting obedience from Grable. The escalation in the second letter, which shifted to $5,000 in cash and specified a meeting time and place, created the operational hinge. The FBI used this moment to trap the offender. The sting was preserved as a model of planning. The FBI used advanced technology, including a 16mm camera, and detailed charts to coordinate agents. This visual documentation ensured that the operation was remembered as more than a moment. It was a preserved example. The arrest was clear. When Alexanderson, 18, moved to grab the package, he was caught. His attempt to control the situation collapsed under the FBI's preparation. The case's legal outcomes added a layered texture. Initially, Alexanderson received probation, but a later extortion note led to a prison sentence. This shift highlighted how leniency can be ineffective when the offender repeats the same behavior. In 1957, Alexanderson attempted to block a CBS TV episode about the case, claiming it used footage and implicated him. The dispute highlighted how the original case could be revived and examined long after legal closure. The case remained relevant because the record was anchored in specific facts: dates, amounts, locations, and aliases. These details ensured the story could be retold without distortion, making it cinematic. For Grable, the case marked her as a celebrity victim. While her life moved on, the threat remained tied to her public identity. The FBI's documentation ensured the case could be retold as both proof and narrative. For the FBI, the case remained an example of successful federal operation, mail-based threats addressed through coordinated surveillance and precise execution. For Alexanderson, the case was a reminder that control was no longer his to claim. His attempt to stop the broadcast in 1957 showed the difficulty of suppressing a story once it's documented. In the end, a story's enduring shape is not defined by the neutralization of the threat but by the preserved record. The threat itself is gone, but the record continues to carry the case forward. The case began with a mailed threat, simple yet powerful enough to demand federal attention. It was not a physical confrontation, but a threat delivered through ordinary channels. The FBI's response created federal jurisdiction, using evidence that could work in public without becoming public. The Bureau transformed written instructions into a controlled trap, turning fear into evidence. The first letter's demand of $25,000 in diamonds was a fantasy of wealth, using formal addresses and an alias. The LEOP. It relied on the mail for distance and the threat for control. When the first demand failed, the second letter reduced the demand to $5,000 in cash, adding a precise time and public location. The new alias, Snow, escalated the threat, and the FBI used that precision to plan their response. The FBI met the second letter with careful design, operational charts, disguises, surveillance, and a 16mm camera. This plan captured the offender's actions and turned the moment of danger into proof. At 9:40 a.m., a blue sedan approached the drop, and when the offender, Alexanderson, moved to collect the package, he was arrested. The swift arrest minimized risks and converted the moment into proof. Legal outcomes were unusual. Alexanderson pleaded guilty and received probation, which reflected age and lack of physical harm. However, after reoffending, he was arrested again and sentenced to prison. This shift demonstrated that leniency does not always stop the impulse. The cultural afterlife of the case began when the FBI preserved it visually. The photos and film of the sting made the case retrievable, transforming it from proof to public narrative. Visual documentation allowed the case to be replayed, making it a part of public memory. In 1957, Alexanderson tried to stop a CBS TV broadcast that used FBI footage. The legal dispute proved that once a case is documented, it can resurface, showing the power of media and how public memory can extend a case's life. The case's enduring significance lies not in criminal genius, but in the mismatch between the offender's self-image and reality. The threat came from an 18-year-old whose methods were more fantasy than sophistication. For Grable, the impact was not just legal, but personal. A mailed threat changes the texture of life, making routine dangerous. The threat became part of her public identity, resurfacing when the case was retold. For the FBI, the case became a demonstration of method. It showed how federal jurisdiction can be created by mail, and how careful planning and documentation lead to successful operations. For Alexanderson, the case ensured his past would not fade. His attempts to control the narrative through legal action failed, as the case had become part of public history. The case teaches that control is contested at every stage. The offender tried to control the victim. The FBI took control of the environment. The justice system controlled consequence. And the offender later tried to control public portrayal. Each stage produced a new record. The case is fixed in history, with dates, places, demands, aliases, and outcomes that resist distortion. It remains a story defined by concrete facts, not myth. The file remains, and the film remains, as proof of the crime. The case continues to be available for retelling, showing how a threat delivered by mail can become a federal matter, how planning leads to capture, and how the story can persist long after the original threat is gone. Like, share, and subscribe to stay with the mystery crime for new cases.